I used to believe that family was something you built with love, not something that could be weaponized against you. I used to believe that sharing a home, sharing meals, sharing the quiet moments of growing up together meant something sacred and unbreakable. I used to believe my stepsister loved me. I was wrong about all of it, and the truth of just how wrong I was nearly destroyed everything I had worked my entire life to build. My name is Emma, and 3 years ago, I discovered that the person I trusted most in this world, the woman I called my sister, had been systematically dismantling my life from the shadows while smiling to my face every single day. This is the story of how I found out, how I fought back, and how I made absolutely certain she would never be able to hurt anyone the way she hurt me ever again. I need to start at the beginning, because you cannot understand the depth of this betrayal without understanding what Vivian and I once meant to each other, or at least what I thought we meant to each other. I was 11 years old when my mother married Richard Clark. My real father had left when I was 3, disappeared one morning and never came back, leaving my mother to raise me alone in a cramped apartment in Manchester while working double shifts as a nurse. My childhood was not unhappy, but it was marked by absence, by my mother's exhausted face when she came home at midnight, by the Christmas presents that were always practical rather than magical, by the quiet understanding that we had to be careful with everything because there was never quite enough. When my mother met Richard at a hospital fundraiser where she was working and he was donating, it felt like our luck had finally changed. Richard was a successful property developer, recently divorced, with a daughter just 2 years younger than me. He was kind in that awkward way that wealthy men sometimes are when they encounter poverty for the first time up close. He fell in love with my mother's gentleness, her quiet strength, the way she never asked him for anything even when he desperately wanted to give her everything. They married 6 months later, and suddenly I was living in a house with a swimming pool, my own bedroom that was bigger than our entire old apartment, and a stepsister named Vivian who was introduced to me with the promise that we would be best friends forever. I remember that first meeting so clearly. Vivian was 9 years old, blonde where I was dark, delicate where I was sturdy, dressed in clothes that probably cost more than my mother made in a week. She looked at me with these enormous blue eyes and smiled this perfect, practiced smile, and she said, "I always wanted a sister." And I believed her. God help me, I believed her completely. The first few years were genuinely good, or at least they seemed that way. Vivian and I shared secrets, had sleepovers in each other's rooms, stayed up late watching films we were not supposed to watch. She taught me about fashion and makeup and the mysterious politics of private schools, and I taught her how to be brave, how to stand up for herself, how to climb trees and skin knees and not cry about it. We were opposites in many ways, but I thought those opposites complemented each other perfectly. My mother was so happy during those years. For the first time in her life, she did not have to worry about money, did not have to work herself into exhaustion just to keep the lights on. Richard was not a warm man, not really, but he was decent, and he genuinely seemed to care about my mother's happiness. He treated me fairly, if not affectionately, and he never made me feel like an intruder in his home. When I was 15, my mother was diagnosed with cancer. It was aggressive, the doctors said, and while they would do everything they could, we needed to prepare ourselves for the worst. I remember standing in the hospital corridor, feeling the ground fall away beneath my feet, feeling like someone had reached into my chest and was slowly crushing my heart. My mother was everything to me, the foundation of my entire existence, and suddenly that foundation was crumbling. Vivian was there for me during those terrible months. She held my hand when I cried, brought me tea when I could not sleep, covered for me at school when my grades started slipping, because I could not concentrate on anything except the fact that my mother was dying. She was the perfect sister, supportive and understanding and present in ways that Richard, with his constitutional inability to handle emotional situations, simply could not be. My mother died 3 weeks before my 16th birthday. The funeral was elegant and expensive, paid for entirely by Richard, and completely inadequate to express what the world had lost. I stood at her graveside and felt something fundamental break inside me, some essential connection to hope and safety that I was not sure I would ever be able to repair. In the months that followed, Vivian became my anchor. She understood grief, she said, because she had lost her own mother to the divorce, which she described as a kind of death in itself. Looking back now, I can see how that comparison diminished my loss, how it centered her experience in the midst of my trauma, but at the time I was simply grateful for any connection, any sense that I was not entirely alone. Richard, to his credit, never tried to replace my mother, never suggested that I should start calling him Dad, or that his home was now truly mine. He provided for me financially, paid for my education, ensured I had everything I needed in a material sense. But emotionally, he retreated even further into his work and his whiskey and his long silences, leaving Vivian and me to navigate adolescence largely on our own. We made a pact when I was 17 and she was 15. We called it the Sisters Forever Pact, and we sealed it with those silver bracelets that you can get customized with your names. We promised that no matter what happened, no matter where life took us, we would always be there for each other. We would be each other's emergency contacts, each other's confidants, each other's chosen family. I wore that bracelet every day for 10 years. I still have it somewhere shoved in a drawer, a reminder of how naive I used to be. I worked hard in school, partly because education felt like the only way to honor my mother's sacrifices, and partly because I understood on some fundamental level that Richard's money was not really mine. I was tolerated in that house, provided for, but I was not truly family. The inheritance, the business, the real wealth would all go to Vivian someday, and I needed to build my own future independent of all that. I got into university on a scholarship, studied business and marketing, and graduated near the top of my class. While Vivian drifted through her own studies with the casual disinterest of someone who knew she would never really need to work, I was interning, networking, building connections that would eventually lead to my own career. By the time I was 25, I had worked my way up to a senior marketing position at a mid-sized firm in London. By 27, I had saved enough to put a deposit on my own flat, nothing fancy but mine, bought with money I had earned through my own effort. I was proud of what I had built, proud of who I was becoming, and I was finally starting to feel like my mother would have been proud too. That was also the year I met Daniel. Daniel Brooks was everything I had never dared to hope I might find. He was kind and funny and ambitious in that passionate way that made you believe anything was possible. He had built his own tech company from nothing, starting in his university dormitory and growing it into something genuinely impressive. When we met at a networking event, he had just secured his first major round of investment funding, and he talked about his work with such infectious enthusiasm that I found myself smiling more in one conversation than I had in months. We started dating that winter, and by spring, I was more in love than I had ever been in my life. Daniel made me feel seen in a way no one had since my mother died. He asked questions about my childhood, my dreams, my fears, and he actually listened to the answers. He remembered small details, surprised me with thoughtful gestures, made me feel like I was the most important person in any room we entered together. I introduced him to Vivian after we had been together for about 4 months. By then, she and I had settled into an adult version of our sisterly relationship. We did not see each other every day anymore, but we texted regularly, had dinner together once or twice a month, and I still considered her one of the most important people in my life. She was working at Richard's company in some vague administrative role, living in a nice flat that Richard paid for, dating a series of men who seemed interchangeable in their blandness and wealth. The dinner where they first met seemed to go well. Vivian was charming, as she always was with new people, asking Daniel questions about his company and laughing at his jokes and making all the right impressed noises when he talked about his work. Daniel told me afterward that he liked her, that it was clear how close we were, that he was glad I had family I could count on. But there was something that night, some moment that I cannot quite pinpoint, but that lingered in my memory long afterward. Something in the way Vivian looked at Daniel when she thought I was not watching. Something in the quality of her attention, too focused, too interested. I dismissed it at the time as paranoia, as my own insecurities about whether someone like Daniel could really want someone like me. I wish I had trusted my instincts. The first year of my relationship with Daniel was the happiest of my adult life. He met Richard at a family dinner and navigated that awkwardness with grace. He held me when I cried on the anniversary of my mother's death. He talked about the future in terms of we and us, and slowly, carefully, I let myself believe that maybe I had finally found the stability and love I had been searching for since I was 16 years old. When Daniel proposed on my 28th birthday, in the restaurant where we had our first date, I said yes before he finished asking the question. The ring was modest compared to what he could have afforded, but he knew me well enough to know I would not want anything flashy. It was perfect. Everything felt perfect. Vivian was the first person I called with the news. She screamed with excitement, demanded to see the ring over video call, and immediately started talking about engagement parties and wedding planning. She offered to be my maid of honor before I even had the chance to ask, and I was so touched by her enthusiasm that I felt guilty for ever having doubted her intentions. We started planning the engagement party together, and it was like being teenagers again, heads bent over magazines and Pinterest boards, dreaming about the future. Vivian had opinions about everything, the venue, the flowers, the guest list, but I appreciated her involvement. She had always been better at these social things than I was, more instinctively understanding of the subtle politics of wealthy London society that Daniel's work required us to navigate. The party was set for 3 months after the proposal, at a rooftop venue in central London that Vivian had somehow secured at a reduced rate through one of Richard's contacts. The guest list included about 60 people, a mix of our friends, Daniel's colleagues and investors, and a handful of family members. Richard confirmed he would attend, which was significant given his general aversion to social events. In the weeks leading up to the party, I noticed that Vivian and Daniel had been texting more frequently. It made sense, I told myself. They were coordinating on the party, and Daniel had mentioned wanting to surprise me with something special that he had asked Vivian to help arrange. It was sweet, I thought. It showed that the people I loved most were working together to make me happy. I noticed other things too, small things that did not seem significant at the time, but that would later assemble themselves into a pattern I could not ignore. Daniel's phone lighting up at odd hours with messages he would glance at and quickly dismiss. Vivian knowing details about Daniel's work that I had not told her. The two of them finishing each other's sentences at dinner one night in a way that suggested an intimacy I had not witnessed developing, but I trusted them. That was my fundamental mistake, the foundation on which all the rest of this disaster was built. I trusted them because I loved them, and I could not imagine that either of them would ever do anything to hurt me. The engagement party was on a Saturday in September. The weather cooperated beautifully, one of those rare London evenings when the sky is clear and the sunset turns everything gold. The venue looked stunning, the guests were elegant and happy, and Daniel held my hand and looked at me like I was the only person in the room. I remember thinking that this was it. This was the moment when my life finally became everything I had ever wanted it to be. The first crack appeared around 9 o'clock. I was talking to one of Daniel's investors, a woman named Helena, who had been instrumental in the early funding of his company. She was telling me about her own wedding, 20-something years ago, offering advice about maintaining a relationship through the stress of building a business. And then she said something that did not quite make sense. Your sister was telling me how involved she's been with the company lately. It must be so nice to have family who can support Daniel's work like that. I smiled and nodded, assuming she was referring to Vivian's involvement in the party planning. But something about her tone suggested more than that. Something about the knowing way she looked at me, like we were sharing an understanding that I did not actually possess. Later, I found Vivian and asked her about it, keeping my voice casual, curious rather than suspicious. She laughed and waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, Daniel asked me to help with some marketing stuff. You know, Richard has so many contacts, and Daniel's been trying to expand his network. It's nothing, really." It was nothing, I told myself. It was family helping family. It was exactly what sisters were supposed to do. But I watched them more carefully after that. I watched the way Daniel's eyes found Vivian across the room. I watched the way she touched his arm when they talked, lingering just a moment too long. I watched them step outside onto the terrace together, supposedly to check on something with the catering, and not return for nearly 20 minutes. I did not say anything that night. The party was too beautiful, the moment too precious, and I convinced myself that I was being paranoid. Jealousy was ugly, I told myself. Suspicion without evidence was toxic. I would not become one of those women who destroyed their own happiness by inventing problems where none existed. But the seed had been planted, and over the following weeks, it began to grow. I started paying closer attention to Daniel's schedule, his explanations for late nights and weekend meetings. I noticed when his stories did not quite add up, when he claimed to be at investor dinners that lasted until midnight, when he came home smelling faintly of perfume that was not mine. I told myself there were innocent explanations. There were always innocent explanations if you looked hard enough. Then I found the messages. It was an accident, truly. Daniel had left his phone on the kitchen counter while he showered, and it lit up with a notification. I glanced at it automatically, the way you do when a screen illuminates in your peripheral vision, and I saw Vivian's name followed by words that stopped my heart. "Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you." I stood there in my kitchen, frozen, my entire body going cold. There had to be an explanation. There had to be some context that would make those words mean something other than what they obviously meant. I was shaking as I picked up the phone, knowing I should not, knowing that what I was about to do would change everything, unable to stop myself. Daniel's password was my birthday. He had told me that once, early in our relationship, said it was romantic. Now it felt like a cruelty, like my own existence was being used to unlock the evidence of my destruction. The messages went back months, long before the engagement, before the proposal, before I had any idea that the two people I loved most were conspiring to betray me. The early messages were almost innocent, friendly, two people getting to know each other. But they escalated quickly, becoming flirtatious, then explicit, then devastating. I read them all, standing there in my kitchen while the shower ran in the other room, while the man I was supposed to marry washed off whatever traces of my sister might still be on his skin. I read about their first kiss at a work event I had been too busy to attend. I read about the hotel room they had started meeting at, always during the day, always when I was safely occupied with my own job. I read about how they laughed at my obliviousness, how Vivian called me trusting to the point of stupidity, how Daniel said he loved me but was not in love with me, not the way he was with her. The shower turned off. I put the phone down exactly where I had found it, and when Daniel came out of the bathroom, still damp, smiling at me like I was his whole world, I smiled back and said nothing. I know that sounds impossible. I know the normal reaction would have been to scream, to cry, to throw things and demand explanations. But something strange happened in those moments of reading their messages. Something inside me went very cold and very quiet. I realized that screaming would accomplish nothing except to make them more careful. I realized that confrontation without preparation would only give them the opportunity to spin the narrative, to make me look hysterical and unreasonable. I realized that if I wanted justice, real justice, I was going to have to be smarter than both of them. So I started to plan. The first thing I needed was evidence, concrete, undeniable proof that would hold up not just in the court of public opinion, but potentially in actual court. I started documenting everything, taking screenshots of their messages when I could access Daniel's phone, noting dates and times and locations. I created a folder on my laptop, encrypted and hidden, and I added to it every single day. But messages alone would not be enough. I needed to understand the full scope of what Vivian had done because I was beginning to suspect that the affair was only part of it. I started asking questions, carefully, casually, in conversations that seemed like normal curiosity. I asked Daniel about his work, about the investors Helena had mentioned, about how the company was doing. I asked Vivian about her job at Richard's company, about what she did all day, about whether she was happy there. Their answers did not match up. Daniel talked about expansion plans that seemed to depend on new funding sources he was being vague about. Vivian talked about being bored at work, about feeling undervalued, about how Richard did not appreciate her contributions. Neither of them mentioned the connection between these two things, but I was starting to see it. I had dinner with Richard one evening, just the two of us, which was unusual enough that he looked at me with concern and asked if everything was all right. I said I just wanted to catch up, wanted to feel connected to the only father figure I had left. He was touched by that, I could tell, and he relaxed into the kind of honesty that he rarely showed. After a few glasses of wine, I asked about Vivian's work. How is she doing at the company? She seems stressed lately. Richard sighed and shook his head. Honestly, Emma, I don't know what to do with her. She's been asking for more responsibility, more access to the financial side of things. But every time I give her something important, she finds a way to mess it up. Last month, she authorized a transfer that was completely outside her authority. £50,000 gone. £50,000. My heart rate spiked, but I kept my voice calm. Gone where? Some investment opportunity she claimed would double our money, but when I looked into it, there was no investment. The company she transferred it to barely exists. I think she got scammed, honestly, but she won't admit it. She just keeps saying the returns are coming. I nodded sympathetically and changed the subject. But inside, my mind was racing. £50,000 transferred to a shell company. An investment opportunity that did not exist. A sister who was sleeping with my fiancé and had never mentioned any of this to me. I started to dig deeper. One of the things I had learned in my marketing career was how to research companies, how to trace ownership structures, how to find financial records, how to follow money through the labyrinth of limited liability and corporate registration. I used those skills now, sitting up late at night while Daniel slept peacefully beside me, tracing the path of that £50,000. The shell company was registered in the British Virgin Islands, which made things more difficult, but not impossible. After days of research, I managed to connect it to another company, and then another, and finally to a name that made everything suddenly, horribly clear. Daniel Brooks. The money Vivian had stolen from Richard's company had gone directly to Daniel. Not as an investment, not as a loan, but as a gift from a woman who was in love with a man who needed capital to expand his business but did not want his fiancé to know where it was coming from. I sat back from my laptop and stared at the screen for a long time. The betrayal I had discovered went so much deeper than an affair. Vivian was not just sleeping with my fiancé. She was stealing from her own father to finance his company. And Daniel was not just cheating on me. He was using my stepsister's obsession to fund his dreams while planning to marry me for, what? Stability? Respectability? The appearance of a normal life while he pursued his actual desires on the side. It was so calculated, so cold, so utterly without conscience that I found myself laughing. Not because it was funny, but because it was so far beyond anything I had imagined that my only options were laughter or complete psychological collapse. I chose laughter, and then I chose revenge. The plan I developed over the following weeks was complicated, requiring patience and timing, and a willingness to pretend that everything was normal, while inside I was burning with rage. I continued to smile at Daniel, to kiss him good morning and good night, to discuss wedding details as though I still intended to marry him. I continued to text Vivian, to meet her for coffee and shopping and all the sisterly activities we had always shared. But every interaction was now a performance, and I was gathering information. I learned that Daniel's company was in more trouble than anyone knew. The expansion he was planning required significantly more capital than Vivian's $50,000 could provide, and his investors were getting nervous. Helena, the woman from the engagement party, had been asking pointed questions about projections and returns that Daniel could not adequately answer. I learned that Vivian had been taking more money from Richard's company, small amounts that flew under the radar, but amounts that were adding up. She was covering her tracks poorly, assuming that her father's trust would protect her indefinitely. I learned that their affair had started even earlier than I had thought, that Vivian had been pursuing Daniel from almost the moment she met him, that she had seen in him an opportunity to finally have something of mine that she wanted. And I learned, finally, the most painful truth of all. Vivian had never loved me, had never even liked me. The years of sisterhood, the shared secrets, the promises of forever, all of it had been a performance. In her messages to Daniel, she talked about me with contempt, describing me as pathetic, desperate for family, so eager to be loved that she would believe anything. She joked about how easy I had always been to manipulate, how my gratitude for being included in her family made me blind to everything she was doing. I cried when I read those messages. I allowed myself one night of genuine grief, curled up in the bathroom with the shower running so Daniel would not hear, mourning the sister I had never actually had. And then I dried my tears and got back to work. My plan had 3 phases. First, I needed to expose the financial fraud to Richard in a way that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. Second, I needed to ensure that Daniel's company collapsed in the most public and humiliating way possible. Third, I needed to guarantee that both of them understood exactly who had brought about their destruction. I started with Daniel's company. One of my closest friends from university was a journalist named Priya, who covered tech and startups for a major financial publication. We had stayed in touch over the years, meeting for drinks occasionally, sharing industry gossip. I knew she had been looking for her next big story, something that would establish her reputation for serious investigative work. I gave her everything I had gathered: the shell company, the transferred funds, the discrepancy between Daniel's public statements about his company's finances and the reality of its precarious situation. I gave her Helena's name as a source who might be willing to talk, suggested she look into similar complaints from other investors. I did not ask her to write a hit piece. I did not need to. The facts spoke for themselves. All I did was provide the thread, and Priya was more than capable of pulling it until the whole garment unraveled. While Priya started her investigation, I worked on phase 2. Richard. I could have simply shown him the evidence I had gathered about Vivian's theft, but I wanted him to discover it himself, wanted the realization to have the full weight of personal betrayal rather than coming secondhand from me, so I started dropping hints. I mentioned at dinner that I had heard about companies experiencing internal fraud, about trusted employees who turned out to be stealing. I asked innocent questions about the company's financial controls, expressed curiosity about how Richard kept track of everything. I suggested, offhandedly, that it might be worth doing a thorough audit just to make sure everything was in order. Richard was resistant at first. The idea that anyone in his company, let alone his own daughter, might be stealing from him was not something he wanted to consider. But I was patient, and I was persistent, and eventually I saw the seed of doubt take root behind his eyes. The audit he commissioned revealed everything. Not just the 50,000 pounds I already knew about, but nearly 200,000 in total, siphoned off over the past 2 years through a series of fraudulent transfers and falsified invoices. Vivian had been stealing from her father since before I even met Daniel, funding a lifestyle she could not afford on her administrative salary, and more recently funding her lover's failing company. Richard called me the day he received the audit results. His voice sounded old in a way I had never heard before, broken by a betrayal that went far beyond money. "She's my daughter," he said, and I could hear that he was crying. How could she do this to me? I comforted him as best I could, playing the role of the loyal stepdaughter, the one who had never asked for anything, who had built her own life without expecting handouts or special treatment. I told him I was sorry. I told him I understood how much it hurt. I did not tell him what else I knew, what was still coming. Priya's article was published on a Tuesday morning. The headline was devastating. "Tech darling built on fraud, inside the financial deception at Brooks Ventures." The article detailed everything: the shell companies, the misappropriated funds, the lies told to investors. It included quotes from Helena and 2 other investors who had grown suspicious, as well as documentary evidence that traced the money directly back to its source. The article did not mention Vivian by name, but it did not need to. Richard read it, recognized the shell company, and made the connection immediately. I was at work when Daniel called me, frantic, wanting to know if I had seen the article, if I knew what was happening. I said I had just seen it, that I was shocked, that I could not believe any of it was true. He said he could explain everything, that it was all a misunderstanding, that someone was clearly trying to destroy him. I told him I loved him and that I was sure we would get through this together. And then I hung up the phone and smiled for the first time in months. The fallout was swift and merciless. Daniel's investors pulled out within days. Without their backing, the company could not make payroll, could not pay its creditors, could not continue to operate. He was facing lawsuits from multiple directions, accusations of fraud and misrepresentation that would take years to sort out in court. Vivian was fired from Richard's company immediately. Richard, devastated by the double betrayal of his daughter, and the man who would have been his son-in-law, could not even bring himself to press charges. But he cut her off completely, financially and emotionally, changing his will to leave everything to charity rather than to the daughter who had stolen from him. And me? I was publicly the victim, the innocent fiancée who had been deceived by both her partner and her sister, the woman who had trusted too much and been rewarded with betrayal. But I was not finished yet. The final phase of my plan required a confrontation, a moment where both of them would understand exactly what had happened and exactly who was responsible. I needed them to know that their destruction had not been bad luck or karma or the natural consequence of their actions. I needed them to know it was me. I arranged a meeting at the flat I had shared with Daniel. He was still living there, unable to afford anywhere else now that his assets were frozen pending the various legal proceedings against him. Vivian was staying with a friend after being evicted from the apartment Richard had been paying for. I told them both that I wanted to talk, that I needed closure before I could move on with my life. They came separately, not realizing the other would be there. The looks on their faces when they saw each other in my living room would have been funny if it had not all been so tragic. I let them sit in uncomfortable silence for a moment before I began. "I know everything," I said. "I have known for months. The affair, the money, the way you both laughed at me behind my back." Daniel started to say something, some protest or explanation, but I held up my hand. "I'm not interested in your excuses. I'm not interested in anything you have to say. I just wanted you both to understand that everything that has happened to you, the article, the audit, all of it, that was me. I did that. I destroyed you both, and I did it deliberately because you deserved it." Vivian's face went pale. She had never imagined that I was capable of something like this. In her mind, I was still the desperate orphan who would put up with anything just to be part of a family. "How could you?" she whispered. I laughed, genuinely laughed, because the question was so absurd. How could I? How could you? You were my sister, Vivian. I loved you. I trusted you with everything I had. And you stole my fiancé, you stole from your own father, and you laughed about how stupid I was for not seeing it. How could you? She had no answer. Neither did Daniel. I told them that I was keeping the flat, that Daniel's name was coming off the lease by the end of the week. I told Vivian that I had made copies of all the evidence, and that if either of them ever tried to contact me or harm me in any way, I would make sure everyone they knew received a complete dossier of their crimes. I told them that I hoped they would be very happy together because they deserved each other, and then I asked them to leave. Daniel went first, gathering a few of his things, unable to meet my eyes. Vivian lingered, looking at me with an expression I could not quite read. Hatred, certainly. But maybe something else too. Fear, perhaps. Or the dawning recognition that she had underestimated me completely. She stopped at the door and turned back. "You're not the person I thought you were," she said. "No," I replied. "I'm the person you made me." She left without another word. I closed the door behind her, locked it, and stood alone in my flat for a long time, feeling the silence settle around me like a weight being lifted. It was over, and somehow, I had won. Part 2. The weeks after the confrontation were strange. I had spent so long planning, so long maintaining the facade of normalcy while burning with secret rage that I was not sure who I was supposed to be now that it was over. The revenge had been satisfying in the moment, but it did not fill the emptiness that Vivian and Daniel had left behind. I threw myself into work. The distraction was welcome, and my boss was sympathetic about what she understood to be a broken engagement caused by infidelity. I did not correct her assumption that I was a passive victim. Letting people think I had been wronged was easier than explaining the cold, calculated campaign I had waged against the people who had betrayed me. Richard reached out about a month after everything fell apart. He wanted to have dinner, wanted to talk. I agreed, partly because I genuinely cared about him despite everything, and partly because I was curious about how he was processing all of it. We met at a quiet restaurant, one where we were unlikely to run into anyone we knew. He looked older than I remembered, diminished by grief and betrayal. When he saw me, he stood and hugged me, holding on longer than he ever had before. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm so sorry for what my daughter did to you." I told him it was not his fault, which was true. Richard had many flaws, but he had never been deliberately cruel, and he had certainly never sanctioned or encouraged Vivian's behavior. He was as much a victim as I was, in his own way. Over dinner, he told me more about the financial damage Vivian had done. The amount she had stolen was significant, but the real cost was to his sense of trust, his belief in his own judgment. He had raised her, loved her, given her everything, and she had repaid him with theft and lies. "I never saw it," he said. "All those years, I never saw who she really was." I understood that feeling intimately. I had spent 15 years believing Vivian loved me, believing we were sisters in every way that mattered. The revelation of her true nature had shaken my understanding of everything, made me question every memory, every shared moment. Richard asked what had happened with Daniel. I gave him the public version, the broken engagement, the discovery of betrayal, the painful process of separating our lives. I did not tell him about my role in the article, about the deliberate campaign to destroy both of them. Some things were better left unsaid. Toward the end of dinner, Richard said something that surprised me. He said that he had been thinking about his will, about what would happen to his estate after he was gone. Vivian was no longer included, he confirmed, but he had been thinking about me. "You've never asked me for anything," he said. "You worked for everything you have, built your own life, never expected handouts or special treatment. You're more my daughter than she ever was." I did not know what to say. The offer was generous beyond anything I had imagined, beyond anything I felt I deserved. I had destroyed his daughter after all, even if he did not know it. I had torn apart his family as surely as Vivian had, even if my motives were different. I told him I needed time to think about it. He understood. We finished dinner and parted ways with promises to stay in touch. In the months that followed, I tried to move on. I redecorated my flat, removing every trace of Daniel, every reminder of the life we had planned together. I started therapy, working through the complex tangle of grief and anger and guilt that I had been suppressing for so long. I focused on my career, earning a promotion that came with more responsibility and better compensation. But I could not stop thinking about Vivian. The rational part of my brain knew that I should let it go, that the revenge was complete, that dwelling on her would only poison my own healing. But there was another part, a darker part that wanted to know what was happening to her, whether she was suffering appropriately, whether justice had truly been served. I had mutual friends who kept me informed, despite my pretense of not wanting to hear about her. Vivian had lost everything, they said. No job, no money, no support from Richard. She was living in a bedsit in a rough part of London, working retail to make ends meet. Daniel had left her almost immediately after the scandal broke, presumably finding a new mark to fund his next venture. I should have felt satisfied by this. Instead, I felt hollow. One evening, about 6 months after the confrontation, I received a text from Vivian. It was the first time she had tried to contact me since that day in my flat. "Can we talk? Please. I know I don't deserve it. But I need to explain. My first instinct was to ignore it. What could she possibly say that would make any difference? What explanation could justify years of betrayal, of theft, of cruelty? But curiosity won out. And something else too, some need for closure that the confrontation had not provided. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop, public and neutral, where I could leave at any time. She was already there when I arrived. She looked different, diminished in ways that went beyond the obvious downgrade in her clothing and makeup. There was a fragility to her that I had never seen before, a vulnerability that seemed genuine rather than performed. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I know you didn't have to." I sat down across from her but did not respond. I wanted to see what she would do, what she would say, whether any of it would be honest. What she told me over the next 2 hours was not what I had expected. She started from the beginning, from her own childhood before Richard married my mother. Her biological mother, she said, had been cold and critical, impossible to please. Vivian had grown up feeling fundamentally inadequate, constantly competing for approval she could never win. When her parents divorced, she blamed herself, believed that she had somehow driven her mother away. And then I arrived. Vivian's voice broke as she described how it felt to suddenly have a new sister, someone her father obviously admired for her work ethic and resilience. She saw the way Richard looked at me with respect, the respect he never seemed to have for her. She heard him compare us, always in my favor, praising my independence while criticizing her dependence. "I hated you," she admitted. "Not at first, not really. At first, I thought maybe we could be friends. Maybe you could teach me how to be the person he wanted me to be. But then I saw how easy everything was for you, how naturally you earned the approval I had been begging for my whole life. And the hate just grew." I listened without interrupting. I was not sure I believed her, not sure any of this excused what she had done, but I needed to hear it. "The theft had started small," she said. Money she needed for things she was too embarrassed to ask Richard for, things that would reveal how financially incompetent she really was. It escalated over time as she convinced herself that she deserved it, that Richard owed her for all the ways he had made her feel inadequate. And Daniel. She closed her eyes when she talked about Daniel. He had seemed like a way out, she said, a chance to finally have something of her own, something that was not connected to Richard or me. She had not intended to fall in love with him. She had not intended for any of it to happen. I waited until she was finished, then asked the question that had been burning in my mind. Did you ever actually care about me, even a little? The silence stretched between us. When she finally answered, her voice was barely a whisper. Yes, and that made it worse. Because every time I hurt you, I had to hate you more to justify it. I had to convince myself you deserved it, that you were stealing my father's love, that everything good in your life came at my expense. It was the only way I could live with what I was doing. I did not know what to do with that information. It did not excuse anything. It did not undo the damage. But it humanized her in ways I had not wanted to consider, complicated the clean narrative of villain and victim that I had constructed to justify my revenge. Did you know? I asked. That the article, the audit, all of it, that it was me? She nodded. I figured it out eventually. No one else had access to that information. No one else had a reason to put all those pieces together. You were the only one who could have done it. And you still wanted to meet me? Even knowing what I did? I deserved it, she said simply. Everything that happened to me, I deserved. I destroyed myself, and you just made sure I couldn't hide from the consequences. That's not revenge, that's justice. I had not expected that. I had expected anger, accusations, attempts to shift blame. The acknowledgement of responsibility threw me off balance. We talked for another hour, not about the betrayal anymore, but about other things. About our childhoods, about our mothers, about the complicated tangle of family and jealousy and unmet needs that had led us to this moment. It was not reconciliation, not exactly, but it was something. An acknowledgement of shared humanity, perhaps. A recognition that we had both been shaped by forces larger than ourselves. When we parted ways, Vivian asked if we could talk again sometime. I said maybe. I was not sure I was ready for forgiveness, not sure I ever would be. But I was starting to understand that revenge, however satisfying, was not the same as healing. The months that followed were a process of rebuilding. I saw Richard regularly, accepting his offer to be included in his estate planning, acknowledging that family was more complicated than biology. I focused on my career, eventually leaving my marketing job to start my own consultancy, using the skills I had developed over years of climbing corporate ladders. I did not see Vivian often, but we texted occasionally. Short messages, nothing profound, updates on our lives, small attempts at connection. I was not sure if I was moving toward forgiveness or simply toward acceptance. Maybe there was no difference. Daniel's legal troubles dragged on for more than a year. He eventually pleaded guilty to several counts of fraud, avoiding prison, but destroying any chance of working in tech again. I followed his case in the news, feeling nothing except a vague relief that it was finally over. The engagement ring he had given me, I sold. The money went to a charity that supported children of single parents, an organization my mother had donated to when she could afford to. It felt like closing a circle, using the remnant of Daniel's betrayal to honor the woman who had taught me what love actually looked like. 3 years after the engagement party where I first suspected the truth, I met someone new. His name was James, and he was nothing like Daniel. Quieter, steadier, with the kind of integrity that showed in small actions rather than grand gestures. We took things slowly, both of us wary from past wounds, building trust one careful step at a time. I told James everything eventually, not just about the betrayal, but about the revenge, about the deliberate campaign I had waged to destroy Vivian and Daniel. I told him because I did not want to start a relationship on secrets, and I needed to know if he could accept the person I had become. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said, "You did what you had to do. They gave you no choice. I don't think less of you for protecting yourself. But I didn't just protect myself," I said. "I destroyed them." "No," he replied. "They destroyed themselves. You just refused to let them take you down with them." I thought about that for a long time afterward, whether there was a moral difference between action and revelation, between destroying someone and simply exposing the truth. I was not sure there was an easy answer. But James's acceptance meant more to me than I could express, a reminder that the darkness I had discovered in myself did not have to define me forever. Vivian and I eventually found something that resembled peace. Not friendship, exactly, but coexistence. She got help for the issues that had driven her behavior, spent years in therapy working through the jealousy and insecurity that had poisoned our relationship. She apologized, genuinely apologized, not just for the affair, but for all the years of pretended sisterhood, for the calculated cruelty she had hidden behind smiles. I accepted the apology because holding on to anger was exhausting, because forgiveness was more for myself than for her. But I did not pretend that things could go back to what they had been. The trust that was broken could not be repaired, only replaced with something more cautious and more honest. Richard passed away 4 years after everything fell apart. The estate he left me was substantial, life-changing in its generosity. I used part of it to establish a scholarship fund in my mother's name, helping students who came from backgrounds like mine, who worked hard despite circumstances that made everything harder. At Richard's funeral, Vivian approached me. She had not been included in the will, but she had been allowed to attend the service. She looked better than the last time I had seen her, healthier, more at peace. "He would have been proud of what you've done with your life," she said. I knew she was right. Richard had always respected hard work, had always admired people who built things rather than inheriting them. In the end, I had been more his child than Vivian ever was, not because of blood, but because of choices. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. We did not embrace. We were not sisters, not anymore, not in any meaningful sense, but we were something. Survivors of the same tragedy, perhaps. 2 women shaped by the same circumstances, who had made very different choices and paid very different prices. James and I married the following spring. It was a small ceremony, nothing like the elaborate engagement party I had once planned with Vivian. My mother's sister, the only blood family I had left, walked me down the aisle. Richard's memory was honored with a reading from his favorite poem. When I said my vows, I thought about everything that had led me to that moment. The grief and the betrayal, the cold, calculating revenge, the slow, painful process of healing. I thought about who I had been and who I had become, and I understood that both versions were real, both were part of me. We cannot control what happens to us, only how we respond. I had responded with destruction, with justice, with the determination that the people who hurt me would not escape consequences. Some might call that revenge. I called it survival. Standing at that altar, holding James's hands, looking into the face of someone who had seen my darkness and loved me anyway, I finally felt something I had not felt since my mother died. I felt whole. The story I have told you is not a simple one. There are no perfect victims, no uncomplicated villains. Vivian's cruelty was born from pain I had never understood. My revenge was as cold and calculated as her betrayal. We were both capable of terrible things, driven by circumstances and choices that tangled together until the line between justice and vengeance blurred beyond recognition. But here is what I know for certain: I would not change what I did. Given the same circumstances, knowing what I know now, I would make the same choices. Because the alternative was to let them win, to let betrayal go unpunished, to let trust be a weapon used against me without consequence. I refused to be a victim. I refused to let their lies and manipulation define my story. And when the dust settled, I was still standing. That is what survival looks like sometimes. Not pretty, not noble, but real. The willingness to do what needs to be done, to protect yourself when no one else will, to ensure that the people who hurt you understand exactly what they have lost. Vivian lost her father's love, her financial security, her relationship, her reputation. Daniel lost his company, his career, his freedom from legal consequence. They lost everything they had stolen and everything they had taken for granted. And I lost the naive belief that family could not betray you, that love was enough to keep you safe, that trust was something you could give freely without fear of consequences. But I gained something too. I gained the knowledge that I was stronger than I ever imagined. I gained the understanding that justice sometimes requires action, not just hope. I gained the ability to look at my reflection and see someone who would not be destroyed by the cruelty of others. My stepsister turned into my enemy, and in the end, I became something she never expected. I became someone who could not be broken. The revenge I took was not about hatred, not really. It was about balance, about ensuring that the scales of justice tipped back toward equilibrium after being weighted so heavily in their favor. They had taken from me, and I made sure they paid it back. Every lie exposed, every theft revealed, every betrayal brought into the light where it could be judged. Now, years later, I have a life that my mother would have been proud of. A career I built myself. A marriage based on honesty and trust. A legacy that will outlast me in the form of scholarships and charitable work. And somewhere in London, Vivian is living her own life, smaller than it used to be, but hopefully more honest. We exchange Christmas cards. We text occasionally when something reminds one of us of the other. We have reached something like peace, not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance. I used to believe that family was unbreakable. I know better now. I know that the people closest to us have the power to hurt us most deeply, and that the only defense against that power is the willingness to fight back. My stepsister turned into my enemy, but I refused to let her destroy me. And in the end, that made all the difference. This is my story. Not a story of pure victimhood, not a story of uncomplicated righteousness. A story of betrayal and revenge and the complicated process of building something new from the wreckage of trust. I am not ashamed of what I did. I am not sorry for the consequences I brought upon them. They made their choices, and I made mine. And when the final accounting was done, I was the one who walked away whole. Some people might judge me for that. Some might say that revenge makes you as bad as the people who wronged you, that the only moral path is forgiveness and moving on. To those people, I would say, you have never been betrayed by someone you loved like a sister. You have never discovered that your entire relationship was a lie, that the person you trusted most was working to destroy you. You do not know what that does to a person, how it changes the fundamental rules of engagement. When someone shows you that there are no rules, you are free to respond in kind. That is not cruelty. That is clarity. I have found peace now, real peace, not the false peace of denial or the fragile peace of unresolved anger. I have done the work of healing, faced the darkness in myself, and emerged on the other side. My mother's memory lives on in the good I have done with the resources I now have. Richard's legacy lives on in the funds that will help students like me build lives of their own. And my story This story lives on as a reminder that betrayal does not have to be the end. Sometimes it is just the beginning of understanding who you really are, what you are capable of, how far you are willing to go to protect yourself. The beginning of a new life, built on the ashes of the old. I lost my stepsister. I lost my fiancé. I lost the naive belief that love was enough to keep you safe. But I found something better. I found myself. And in the end, that is the only revenge that truly matters.